Every top Nazi leader looked the part. Himmler was gaunt and fanatical. Heydrich was ice-cold and predatory. Goebbels was sharp-tongued and ruthless. And then there was Hermann Göring, a morphine-addicted, medal-obsessed showman who reportedly built one of the largest model railways in Europe, threw costume hunting parties for foreign diplomats, and called the years 1933 to 1945 his 12 decent years. He looked like the opposite of every other Nazi leader. Contemporary observers considered him the most popular figure in the regime. Charming, approachable, the one foreign ambassadors actually wanted to sit next to at dinner. But Goring personally signed the one-paragraph order that set the Holocaust in motion, and then went back to his looted art collection like it was a normal Tuesday. So how did the Nazi leadership's most theatrical personality end up with more blood on his paperwork than almost anyone else? Before the medals and the hunting costumes and the stolen masterpieces, Hermann Göring was something far more conventional, a genuine war hero. Born in Rosenheim, Bavaria, on the 12th of January 1893, Göring entered the First World War as an infantry officer before transferring to the air service, where he became one of Germany's most decorated fighter pilots. By 1918, he had 22 confirmed aerial victories and commanded Jagdgeschwader 1, the legendary fighter wing once led by Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron himself. When the war ended, Göring wasn't just another bitter veteran drifting through the wreckage of the Kaiser's empire. He was a celebrity. His name carried weight in aristocratic circles, in military clubs, in the salons of old Prussian families who still respected what a Pour le Mérite medal meant. That distinction would matter enormously in the years ahead. He found Adolf Hitler in the early 1920s, and what he brought to the Nazi movement was something none of the other early followers could offer: respectability. Himmler was a failed chicken farmer. Goebbels was a bitter academic with a club foot and a grudge. Hitler himself was a former corporal with no social standing. But Göring opened doors to people who would never have taken a meeting with a street corner agitator. He lent the movement a veneer of legitimacy at a time when it desperately needed one. Then came the Beer Hall Putsch on November 9th, 1923. Hitler's botched attempt to seize power in Munich. Göring marched alongside Hitler and caught a bullet in the groin. The wound was severe, and the morphine they gave him for the pain became its own kind of trap. He fled to Austria, then drifted across Europe. Through clinics in Venice, through a long recovery in Rome, and eventually into Langbro Asylum in Sweden in 1925, where he was treated for morphine dependency. By the time he returned to Germany in the late 1920s, the worst of his addiction had subsided, though his relationship with opioids would shadow him for years. But the hunger that drove him back into Nazi politics was something else entirely. A desperate need to matter again, to reclaim the prestige he had lost. And he brought tools that no other Nazi leader possessed: aristocratic connections, combat credentials, and the ability to walk into any room in Germany and be taken seriously. That combination made him indispensable. It also made him extremely dangerous, because Göring never cared about ideology the way Himmler or Heydrich did. He cared about power, about status, about reward. And in the Nazi system, that kind of motivation could accomplish terrible things without ever raising its voice. On the nights of 9th and 10th November 1938, mobs across Germany and Austria attacked Jewish communities in what became known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Synagogues burned. Jewish-owned businesses were smashed apart. Dozens of people were killed, and tens of thousands were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The destruction was visible from the streets of every major German city. 3 days later, Goring called a meeting of senior officials. But he was not outraged by the violence against Jewish citizens. He was outraged by the economics. German insurance companies, he pointed out, would now be liable for the property damage, because the destroyed shops and buildings were insured under German law. Goods that the war economy needed had gone up in smoke. The waste offended him on a practical level. His actual recorded complaint from the meeting was blunt. It was absurd, he said, to empty and set fire to a Jewish store when a German insurance company had to cover the damage. That was the problem he saw, not the beatings, not the arrests, not the lives destroyed in a single night of state-sponsored terror. The broken windows. His solution was elegant in its cruelty. Rather than punish the perpetrators, he imposed a collective fine on the Jewish community itself. 1 billion Reichsmarks, levied on the victims to pay for the damage done to their own property. He then issued decrees barring Jews from owning businesses, forcing them to sell their assets at fractions of their value. Assets that flowed directly into the German war economy he controlled. In one meeting, Goring stripped an entire community of its remaining economic existence. And he did it not with ideological fury, but with the cold logic of a man balancing a national budget. If this is changing how you see Goring, hit subscribe, because this is just the beginning. This is the detail that breaks the caricature wide open. Goring was not less evil than the fanatics around him. He was evil with a spreadsheet, and in some ways, that made him more effective. Ideologues like Himmler needed to believe in what they were doing. Goring only needed to profit from it. And that difference shaped everything he touched, from the secret police he built to the palace he filled with stolen art. Between 1933 and 1934, Goring did something that most people have forgotten. He personally created the Gestapo. As Minister-President of Prussia, the largest German state, he transformed the existing political police into a new instrument of state terror. He suspended legal protections, authorized arrests without warrant or trial, and built the infrastructure of surveillance and intimidation that would define Nazi rule for the next 12 years. The Gestapo didn't emerge from some abstract bureaucratic process. One man decided it should exist, and that man was Hermann Göring. But then he handed it over. In 1934, he ceded control of the Gestapo to Heinrich Himmler, not because he had moral qualms about what the organization was doing, but because he had gotten bored. Shinnier things had caught his attention. He wanted the Luftwaffe, which he was building from scratch into the world's most powerful air force. He wanted the 4-year plan, which gave him control over Germany's entire war economy. He wanted more titles, and by 1940, he had accumulated more than any other figure in the Reich, culminating in the unique rank of Reichsmarschall, a position created specifically for him. This became the defining pattern of Göring's career. Build the instrument of terror, hand the horror to someone more committed, and move on to the next prize. He created the machinery that made Nazi repression possible. Then let other men operate it while he went hunting at his country estate. The result was a kind of moral distance that other Nazi leaders never achieved. Not because Göring was less guilty, but because he had arranged things so that his fingerprints were always one step removed from the worst outcomes. But the single most consequential thing Göring ever put his signature on was still years away. And when it came, it fit on a single page. 60 kilometers north of Berlin, deep in the forests of the Schorfheide, Göring built himself a world. Karinhall, named after his first wife Karin, who had died in 1931, started as a modest hunting lodge. By the late 1930s, it had become something closer to a private palace. The estate featured a 34-metre art gallery, a private cinema, elaborate bathhouses, exotic animals roaming the grounds, and staged hunting parties where foreign dignitaries were entertained with Renaissance-level pageantry. Goring's home movies from this period are striking. They show him far more often in elaborate hunting costumes, leather boots, feathered hats, medieval-style tunics, than in military uniform. While Himmler wore his austere SS black and Heydrich projected cold Aryan severity, Goring dressed like a character from a Wagner opera. He posed with hunting trophies, entertained guests beside roaring fireplaces, and moved through his estate like a man who had confused himself with a Bavarian prince from another century. But the art on those walls told a different story. The masterpieces hanging in Karinhal's gallery, Cranach's, Vermeer's, Rembrandt's, tapestries, sculptures, were not purchased. They were looted. Most had been seized from Jewish families across occupied Europe or stripped from museums in France, the Netherlands, and Poland. Goring's personal art collection eventually numbered over 1,000 pieces, making it one of the largest private holdings assembled during the war. His agents scoured conquered territories for works to add to the collection, often arriving just behind the advancing Wehrmacht. This is where the opposite image stops being amusing and starts being obscene. Every painting on those walls, every sculpture in those halls, every hunting party thrown for a foreign diplomat, all of it was funded by the dispossession machinery that Goring had helped create. The lifestyle wasn't separate from the crimes. It was the reward for them. He didn't just look different from the other Nazi leaders. He had built himself a palace on the proceeds of theft, persecution, and eventually genocide. And he enjoyed every minute of it. July 31st, 1941. From his desk in Berlin, Hermann Göring signed a single letter addressed to Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the Reich Security Main Office. The letter was short, one paragraph of bureaucratic language. It charged Heydrich with making all necessary preparations in regard to organisational and financial matters for bringing about a complete solution of the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. One paragraph. No dramatic scene, no raised voices or secret midnight meetings. Just a typed memo with a signature at the bottom. But this letter became the key administrative link between Hitler's broad genocidal intent and the detailed operational machinery of the final solution. It was the document Heydrich would present at the Wannsee conference 6 months later to silence bureaucratic objections from other ministries, proof that the order came from the highest levels of the Reich, carrying the authority of Hitler's formally designated successor. When sceptical officials questioned whether they had authorization, Heydrich pointed to this single page. The man in the feathered hunting costume, the showman, the art collector, the host of lavish parties, had authorized the Holocaust with a memo and moved on with his day. There was no agonizing, no hesitation recorded in any document or testimony. It was administrative business, handled between other administrative business, by a man whose primary concern that summer was the expansion of his art collection and the management of Germany's wartime economy. You would think this would be the moment the regime held Goring accountable, the signature that tied him directly to the worst crime of the 20th century. But the opposite happened. His downfall came not from the genocide, but from losing an air war. Of all his titles and all his powers, the Luftwaffe was the thing Goring actually cared about. It was his personal military fiefdom, the force he had built from nothing, the source of his Reichsmarschall rank, the foundation of his reputation as a man who delivered results. He had staked everything on air power, and for the first years of the war, it had paid off spectacularly. The Luftwaffe had crushed Poland. It had shattered France. It had terrorized cities from Warsaw to Rotterdam. But the Battle of Britain in 1940 exposed the Luftwaffe's limits. Goring had promised Hitler that his bombers could break British morale and achieve air superiority over the English Channel. They could not. The campaign ended in failure, and for the first time, Goring's confidence looked like bluster rather than competence. Then came Stalingrad in the winter of 1942. The German Sixth Army was surrounded, and Goring personally assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled troops by air, roughly 300 tons of supplies per day. It was a promise that defied basic mathematics. The Luftwaffe managed barely a fraction of that figure, and the Sixth Army starved, froze, and eventually surrendered. After Stalingrad, Goring's influence collapsed. Hitler began turning to other men: Martin Bormann for political management, Albert Speer for armaments production, Himmler for internal security. Goring retreated further into the comforts of Harrenhal, spending more time with his art collection and less time in the war rooms where decisions were made. By 1944, he was largely irrelevant to the military conduct of the war, a figurehead clinging to titles that no longer carried real authority. The irony cuts deep. The opposite Nazi was not pushed aside for being too corrupt, too flamboyant, or too detached from ideology. He was pushed aside for being incompetent at the one job he actually cared about. The Reich tolerated his plundering, his costumes, and his lifestyle, but it could not tolerate losing the air war. Leading from the dock at Nuremberg in 1945, most of the defendants tried to distance themselves from the regime. They claimed ignorance, blamed superiors, or insisted they had merely followed orders. Goring did the opposite. He appointed himself the informal leader of the defendants, coaching their defense strategies in the corridors, giving pep talks to those who wavered, and effectively rebuilding a miniature Nazi hierarchy inside the courtroom. Other defendants looked to him for cues on how to behave, what to say, and how much to admit. When his turn came to speak, Goring did not plead for mercy or express remorse. He lectured the tribunal on legal procedure. He challenged the court's jurisdiction. He framed his guilt as a tragic misjudgment. He had believed, but erred. The performance was polished, almost theatrical, delivered with the confidence of a man who still believed he was the most important person in the room. Prosecutors and journalists noted that he seemed energized by the trial in a way the other defendants were not. He had lost weight during imprisonment, kicked his morphine habit entirely, and appeared sharper and more focused than he had in years. Even at the end, Goring's opposite nature was not charm or eccentricity. It was a refusal to accept that the show was over, a compulsive need to command attention, to lead, to perform, even in a courtroom that was preparing to sentence him to death. The last trick. On October 1st, 1946, the tribunal found Hermann Göring guilty on all 4 counts: conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death by hanging. He requested execution by firing squad, a soldier's death befitting his rank. The request was denied on the night of October 15, 1946, just hours before his scheduled execution. Goring bit down on a cyanide capsule in his cell. He was dead within minutes. How he obtained the capsule remains genuinely uncertain. Competing theories point to a sympathetic American guard, a package smuggled through his personal belongings, or a capsule he had concealed on his body for months without detection. None of these explanations has ever been definitively confirmed, but the effect was unmistakable. He denied the hangman his work. and the Allies their final act of justice. His body was cremated alongside the executed defendants, and his ashes were scattered in a river to prevent any memorial or gravesite. Carinhall had already been destroyed, blown up by retreating German forces in the final weeks of the war, its stolen art evacuated, its grandeur reduced to rubble in the Brandenburg forest. The man who called mass murder his 12 decent years made sure nobody else got to write his ending. And that final act captured something essential about who Goring really was. Not the opposite of the Nazi system, but a revelation of how the system actually worked. Regimes of mass murder do not run on fanatics alone. They run on careerists, on opportunists, on men who sign the paperwork, collect the spoils, and never once stop to ask whether any of it is wrong. Goring was not a contradiction of the Third Reich. He was its purest product. A man who proved that you do not need to believe in evil to commit it. You just need to benefit from it. Thanks for watching History Hangover. If you found this video insightful, check out our other deep dives into the hidden aftermath of the Third Reich. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next upload.